It's important to understand the distinction between a recession and a depression. Recession has a kind of a technical, quantitative definition. It's 2 consecutive quarters of declining GDP. There are a few other bells and whistles involving employment and so forth, but 2 consecutive quarters of declining GDP is a good rule of thumb. A depression is different. Depressions are much more long-lasting, and people incorrectly assume that, well, gee, if a recession is 2 quarters of declining GDP, depression is worse. A depression must be 10 quarters of declining GDP, like a really long recession. And that's not the definition. A depression is, you can have growth in a depression, but the point is it's depressed growth. In other words, it's growth below trend. For example, take the expansion from 10-year expansion from 2009 to 2019. The economy grew for 10 years. It was the longest expansion in U.S. history, but it was also the weakest expansion in U.S. history. Average annual growth was about 2.2%, and all recoveries since 1980, average growth was 3.2%. So in other words, you were growing at a full percentage point less than the trend. And so it's that below trend growth, depressed growth relative to trend. That's what makes a depression. And that's what we're in now. So we had growth in the third quarter. That's fine. We'll probably have growth in the fourth quarter, although they keep revising the data downwards, so that target gets smaller. The question is, where are we now? My view is we're in a second technical recession in the depression. And by the way, this happened in the original Great Depression from 1929 to 1940. There were 2 technical recessions. There was a recession from 1929 to 1933, very severe. And then there was growth. 1933 was one of the best years in the stock market, 34, 35, 36. We had growth. But the problem was we had dug such a deep hole that even with growth, you weren't back to where you were. So in 1934 or 35, unemployment fell from 25% to 14%. That sounds good, except it's still 14%. In other words, it's still extraordinarily high. And then 1937, 38, we had a second recession. And that's what prolonged it and turned it into the Great Depression. We're going through something similar right now. We're going to have a recession. This will be what they call back-to-back recession. We had recession in pretty much the first half of 2020 and a new recession beginning in the first quarter, all in the context of a Great Depression. So I focus on the depression aspect of it. You can have growth. You can have declining unemployment. There are certainly investment opportunities, but you're looking at depressed growth. You're looking at a prolonged period of change behavior. We're not going to get back to normal. Forget about normal. We'll live through it. We'll come out the other side, but things will be permanently different. And that affects all kinds of expectations about growth. But again, you got to go back to the 2009, 2019 recovery, 10-year recovery, and I said growth was 2.2%. Trend growth prior to that, going back to 1980, was 3.2%. If you want to go back to the end of World War II, it was more like 4.2%. So that's the kind of growth. So you say, gee, 2.2, 3.2, it's only 1 percentage point. What's the big deal? No, 1 percentage point applied to a $20 trillion economy, compounded over 10 years, that adds up to $4 to $5 trillion in lost wealth. In other words, yeah, we had an expansion, but it would have been $4 trillion greater. There would have been $4 trillion more wealth created if we had been able to get back to 3.2%, at which we did not. The same thing is true today. We're not going to get back to 2019 levels of growth until 2023 at the earliest. We're not going to get back to 2019 employment levels in terms of total jobs until 2025 at the earliest. That's if nothing goes wrong in the meantime. But I expect a number of things will go wrong, including a new recession right now. A lot of people don't know, they know that the stock market peaked in October 1929, and it crashed 89.2% by 1932. So almost 90%. That's what a real market crash looks like. And then you ask people, when did it get back to the 1929 level? When did it get back to the old high? And people go, it must have been late 30s, early 40s. No, it was 1954. In other words, it took 25 years to get back to the old high. The Nikkei index in Japan hit 40,000 in 1989. It's still not there. That's people talk about the lost decade. We'll try 3 lost decades. Here we are over 30 years later, and it's still nowhere near the old high. And so and I would say Japan's been in a depression the whole time. So that's what depressions look like. They're multi-year. They're actually intergenerational. You can have growth, but it's not trend growth, and it's not enough to overcome the damage that was done. So we're still way below even with growth in the third and fourth quarters, we're still well below the 2019 base, and we're not going to get to that level for several years at least. When you look around the world, Japan's population is declining. Russia is declining. Europe is declining. China is flat, but they're approaching a level where they're not going to be at replacement levels. Of course, this is the legacy of the one-child policy, which was, we don't have to do a deep dive on that, but that was one of the great blunders of history, and aging rapidly. So Japan's flatline. Now, until recently, the United States population had been growing, not at a high rate, but faster than all those other countries I mentioned, mainly because of immigration. The natural birth rate of people in the country was not much better than Europe, at or slightly below replacement level, but we had enough immigration to increase the population. But partly because of the policies during the Trump administration, that immigration has been truncated. So we may now be closer to a flat, shall we say, population growth. And of course, that affects output. There are lots of ways to think about GDP, the four-part definition: consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. But there's an even simpler way to think about it, get to the same place, which is how many people are working and how productive are they? It's working population times productivity. Productivity has been flattish, not very strong for reasons that are not entirely well understood, but it's just the case. And population growth, here we're talking about the labor force, not the total number of people from coast to coast, but how many people are in the labor force. That labor force participation has been declining. If your population's declining and your productivity is declining, your GDP is not growing very much at all. That is the situation we're facing in the United States. Now, if you don't have a job, but you're not looking for a job, you're actually not counted as unemployed. But that's not the number that matters. The number that matters is labor force participation. So what's happened is tens of millions of Americans have left the workforce. And I'm talking ages 25 to 54. I'm not talking about a 68-year-old who wants to keep working, or a teenager, or we're not talking about disabled. There are perfectly good reasons for people not to be in the workforce. There are always some, but we're talking about able-bodied individuals between the ages of 25 and 54, prime working ages, who have left the workforce. If you're not banging on the door of the unemployment office looking for a job, they don't count you as unemployed, but you're not working and you're not producing. And so I look at that number because to me it's a better gauge of economic growth. And the other thing is that there is a major disjoint, if you will, between the stock market indices and the health of the economy. So there's no relationship between how the stock market indices are doing and how the economy is doing. When we get back to the economy, who suffered the most and who continues to suffer the most? Small and medium-sized enterprises. So, and people look down their nose at that and they go, you're a small business, who cares? Or you're not Apple Computer, whatever. Sorry, those small businesses are 45% of GDP and 50% of all jobs.